Have you ever noticed how you become a slightly different person depending on who you're around? Around your friends, you act one way. Around your family, another. At work, you become someone else entirely. You laugh at jokes you don't actually find funny. You agree with opinions you don't really believe. You hide parts of yourself just to avoid being judged. And the strange part is, most of the time you don't even realize you're doing it. But here's a question most people are afraid to ask themselves. What if the person everyone knows isn't the real you? What if the version of you your friends see, your coworkers see, even your family sees, is actually a character you've slowly learned to perform? A role carefully shaped by expectations, approval, and the silent fear of rejection. Because the truth is, most people aren't living authentically. They're performing. Performing to be liked. Performing to be accepted. Performing to fit into a world that quietly teaches us one rule from the moment we're born. Be who people want you to be, not who you actually are. And the most unsettling part, many people spend their entire lives playing this role without ever realizing they're acting. But before we talk about authenticity, we need to understand why humans start performing in the first place. Because the reason might surprise you. The hidden pressure of society. To understand why so many people spend their lives performing, we need to go back thousands of years. Long before social media, long before modern society, humans lived in small tribes. Survival depended on something very simple: belonging. If your tribe rejected you, you didn't just feel lonely, you were in danger. Being cast out meant losing protection, resources, and connection. In many cases, rejection meant death. So over thousands of years, the human brain developed a powerful survival instinct. Seek approval, avoid rejection. Even today, that instinct is still running quietly in the background of your mind. This is why criticism can feel so painful, why being ignored can feel unbearable, why people will often change themselves just to fit in. Without even realizing it, we begin adjusting our behavior to match the expectations around us. At work, you act confident even when you're unsure. With certain friends, you pretend to enjoy things you don't actually like. At family gatherings, you hide opinions that might cause conflict. You laugh at jokes you don't find funny. You nod along to conversations you don't agree with. You say things like, "Yeah, I love that too," even when you don't. These small adjustments seem harmless at first. In fact, they often make life easier. After all, social harmony feels good. Being accepted feels good. But something subtle begins to happen when you repeat this pattern over and over again. Each time you hide your real thoughts. Each time you suppress how you truly feel. Each time you adjust yourself just to avoid discomfort. You put on what psychologists often call a social mask. A version of yourself designed not to express who you really are, but to manage how other people see you. At first, this mask feels temporary, like something you wear only when necessary. But over time, the mask becomes easier to wear. You start putting it on automatically. You stop questioning whether the opinions you express are actually yours. You stop noticing when your behavior changes, depending on the people around you. And slowly, something strange begins to happen. The line between who you are and who you perform starts to blur. The mask becomes smoother, more convincing, more comfortable, until one day, you're no longer sure where the performance ends and where the real you begins. And that's when something dangerous starts to happen. Because when a performance lasts long enough, it doesn't just stay a performance. It becomes your identity. The mask becomes your identity. At first, pretending feels temporary. You tell yourself things like, "I'm just being polite. I'm just trying to fit in. This is just how the world works." And in small doses, that's true. Every human being adjusts their behavior, depending on the situation. But the real problem begins when the performance never stops. Because the human brain learns through repetition. The more you repeat a behavior, the more natural it becomes. What once felt fake slowly starts to feel normal. Think about it. The first time you hide your real opinion, it feels uncomfortable. The second time, it's easier. The 10th time, it feels automatic. And before you even realize what's happening, something subtle begins to shift inside you. What started as acting slowly becomes habit. Habit becomes personality. And personality eventually becomes identity. You're no longer just performing confidence. People now see you as a confident person. You're no longer just pretending to enjoy something. People assume that's part of who you are. And the strange part is, after enough time, even you start believing the story. But deep down, something still feels slightly off. Because somewhere beneath the performance, the real you is still there. Quiet, ignored, waiting. This is why so many people reach a point in life where they suddenly feel disconnected from themselves. Maybe it happens in their late 20s, maybe in their 30s or 40s. On the outside, everything looks successful. A stable job, a social life, a routine that seems perfectly normal. But internally, there's a strange feeling they can't quite explain, a quiet thought that whispers, "How did I end up here?" Imagine someone who chose their career not because they loved it, but because it impressed their parents. They followed the path that made everyone proud. They achieved the milestones society celebrates, but years later, they wake up every morning feeling empty, because the life they built was designed for approval, not fulfillment. Or think about someone who stays in relationships not because they feel deeply connected, but because they're afraid of disappointing others. So they continue smiling, continue pretending, continue playing the role expected of them. From the outside, their life looks stable, but internally, they feel like a stranger inside their own story. This is the hidden danger of living through performance. The longer you act, the easier it becomes to forget who you were before the acting started. Your real opinions become harder to access. Your real desires become unclear. Your real emotions become buried beneath layers of expectation. And then, one day, something unsettling happens. You look at your own life and feel like an observer instead of the main character, like you've been following a script written by someone else. And this is why so many people wake up in their 30s or 40s with a terrifying realization. They spent years building a life that never truly felt like their own. But the most painful part of this experience isn't the confusion. It's the feeling that comes with it. A quiet, uncomfortable feeling that many people struggle to explain. The feeling of slowly becoming a stranger to yourself. And once that feeling appears, it can change everything. The silent crisis. Feeling like a stranger to yourself. For many people, the moment of realization doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps in quietly. At first, it's just a subtle feeling, something you can't quite explain. Maybe you notice that social interactions leave you unusually exhausted, not physically tired, but mentally drained. You spend hours around people, talking, smiling, reacting, yet afterward, you feel like your energy has completely disappeared. And the strange part is, you don't always know why. Psychologists often explain this as identity fatigue. The exhaustion that comes from constantly managing how others perceive you. Because when you're performing, you're not just existing. You're monitoring yourself. You're thinking about what to say, how you sound, how you appear, whether people approve of you. It's like running dozens of mental calculations every minute, just to maintain the character you've created. Over time, that constant self-monitoring becomes exhausting. And that's when other signs start to appear. You begin seeking validation more often than you realize. Before making decisions, you wonder what others will think. Before expressing opinions, you ask yourself if people will agree. Before being honest, you hesitate, afraid of being disliked. Slowly, your sense of direction starts to weaken. Because if your identity is shaped by other people's expectations, then your decisions are shaped by them too. You begin asking questions like, what would people respect? What would make others proud? What would make me more acceptable? What do I actually want? And when someone loses connection with that question long enough, something deeper begins to happen. Life can start to feel strangely empty, not because nothing is happening, but because what's happening doesn't feel personally meaningful. From the outside, everything might look fine. You may have achievements, relationships, routines, all the things society tells us should make life fulfilling. But internally, there's a quiet feeling that something essential is missing. It's the feeling of living a life that looks right, but doesn't feel right. And this is where the silent crisis begins. A crisis that millions of people experience, but rarely talk about. Because it's hard to explain the feeling of being surrounded by people, yet feeling disconnected from yourself. It's hard to explain why success sometimes feels strangely hollow. It's hard to explain why you sometimes feel like you're watching your own life from the outside instead of truly living it. But here's the deeper psychological truth behind this experience. When your actions constantly conflict with who you truly are, your mind experiences identity tension, a quiet internal conflict between the person you present to the world and the person you actually feel like inside. And if that tension continues long enough, it begins to affect everything. Your motivation, your confidence, your sense of meaning. Because humans aren't designed to live permanently disconnected from themselves. Eventually, the mind starts asking a question that can no longer be ignored. Whose life am I actually living? But here's the part almost nobody talks about. This entire cycle is powered by something incredibly powerful and incredibly addictive. Approval. And once approval becomes the center of your identity, escaping that cycle becomes much harder than people realize. The cost of living for approval. At the center of this entire problem is something that feels harmless on the surface. Approval. Almost everyone wants it. A compliment, a like on social media, a nod of respect from coworkers, a proud smile from family. These moments feel small, but they trigger something powerful inside the brain. Every time someone approves of us, the brain releases dopamine, the same chemical connected to pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's the brain's way of saying, "That felt good. Do it again." And at first, there's nothing wrong with that. Approval can encourage positive behavior. It can strengthen relationships. It can motivate growth. But the danger begins when approval slowly becomes the source of your identity. When the question shifts from, "What do I believe?" to, "What will people approve of?" This is where the trap quietly forms. Because the more you rely on approval to feel valuable, the more control other people gain over how you live your life. Imagine someone who constantly adjusts their personality, depending on who they're around. With one group of friends, they act outgoing and confident. With another group, they become quiet and agreeable. At work, they pretend to be ambitious even when they feel exhausted. With family, they hide opinions that might cause disappointment. On the surface, this flexibility might look like social intelligence, but internally, it creates something much more complicated. A person who constantly adapts for approval begins to lose a stable sense of self. They start measuring their worth based on how others respond to them. If people approve, they feel good. If people criticize or reject them, they feel deeply shaken. Their emotional stability becomes tied to the reactions of others. And that's when anxiety often begins to appear. Because when your identity depends on approval, you start fearing the loss of it. You overthink conversations. You replay interactions in your head. You wonder if you said something wrong, or if someone secretly dislikes you. And without realizing it, you slowly become trapped in people-pleasing, saying yes when you want to say no, agreeing when you want to disagree, prioritizing other people's comfort over your own truth. But the deeper cost of this lifestyle is something many people don't see coming. Over time, constant people-pleasing begins to create resentment, not necessarily toward others, but toward life itself, because deep down, a part of you knows something important is being sacrificed. Your honesty, your individuality, your freedom to be yourself. You may start feeling frustrated without fully understanding why. Frustrated with work, frustrated with expectations. But the real source of that frustration isn't always the people around you. Sometimes it's the quiet realization that you've been living according to everyone else's script. And the more approval you seek, the more that script begins to control your identity. But here's the difficult truth most people avoid. Escaping this cycle isn't as simple as people say. Because authenticity comes with a cost, too. A cost many people are deeply afraid to pay. And that cost is rejection, the fear that keeps people performing. If living authentically is so important, why do so many people struggle to do it? Why do intelligent, self-aware individuals still find themselves hiding parts of who they are? The answer is simple, but deeply uncomfortable. Fear. Not just ordinary fear, the fear of rejection. Because the moment you stop performing, something changes in the way the world responds to you. When you begin expressing your real opinions, not everyone will agree. When you stop pretending to enjoy things you don't like, some people may feel uncomfortable. When you start setting boundaries instead of always saying yes, certain relationships may shift. And for many people, that possibility feels terrifying. After all, human beings are wired to seek belonging. We want to be liked. We want to be accepted. We want to feel like we matter to the people around us. So the mind starts whispering protective thoughts. What if people think I'm difficult? What if they stop liking me? And without realizing it, we return to the familiar safety of performance. Because performance feels safer than honesty. Performance protects us from conflict. Performance protects us from criticism. Performance protects us from standing alone. But here's the uncomfortable psychological truth most people eventually discover. When a relationship depends on a version of you that isn't real, that relationship isn't truly connected to you. It's connected to the character you're playing. Think about it for a moment. If someone only accepts you when you agree with them, only values you when you behave a certain way, only feels comfortable when you hide parts of yourself, then their connection isn't with your authentic self. It's with the performance. And this realization can feel painful at first, because authenticity can change relationships. When you begin being more honest, some people may feel confused. Some may resist the change. A few might even distance themselves. But here's something important to understand. When people walk away because you stop pretending, they're not rejecting your true self. They're simply rejecting the role they expected you to keep playing. And while that loss can feel uncomfortable in the moment, it also creates something powerful. Space. Space for relationships that are based on honesty instead of performance. Space for conversations where you don't have to filter every thought. Space for connections where your presence feels natural instead of exhausting. Because the paradox of authenticity is this. The moment you stop trying to be liked by everyone, you finally give people the chance to know the real you. But authenticity doesn't start with changing how others see you. It begins with something much quieter, something that many people rarely take the time to do, reconnecting with themselves. Because after years of performing, most people don't just need courage. They need to rediscover who they actually are. And that raises an important question. If someone has spent years adjusting themselves for approval, how do they begin finding their real identity again? Rediscovering your authentic self. After years of adapting, pleasing, and performing, a lot of people ask the same question. How do I even know who I really am anymore? Because when you've spent a long time adjusting yourself to match expectations, your real identity can start to feel distant, almost unfamiliar. But reconnecting with your authentic self doesn't require a dramatic life change. It usually begins with something much smaller. Awareness. The first step is simply noticing when you're performing. Most performances happen automatically. They're habits built over years. So start asking yourself a simple question in everyday situations. Am I saying this because I truly believe it, or because I want approval? You might notice moments where you laugh even though the joke didn't feel funny. Moments where you agree just to avoid tension. Moments where you silence your real thoughts because it feels safer. At first, you don't need to change anything. Just notice. Because awareness breaks the unconscious pattern. Once you start recognizing the performance, something powerful happens. You gain the ability to choose, and that leads to the second practice, small acts of honesty. Authenticity doesn't mean suddenly confronting everyone or expressing every thought without care. Real authenticity is quieter and more grounded. It shows up in small moments, saying, "Actually, I see it a little differently," or simply saying, "I don't really enjoy that, but I'm glad you do." These small expressions of honesty may feel uncomfortable at first. Your mind might immediately worry about how others will react. But over time, something important begins to shift. You start experiencing what it feels like to exist without constantly editing yourself. And that feeling is surprisingly freeing. The third practice is something modern life rarely encourages, but authenticity desperately needs it. Time alone. Not loneliness, not isolation, but intentional solitude. Because when you're constantly surrounded by opinions, expectations, and noise, it becomes very difficult to hear your own voice. Solitude creates space for reflection. Space to ask questions you usually ignore. Questions like, what do I genuinely enjoy when nobody is watching? What beliefs do I actually hold? What kind of life would feel meaningful to me? These questions don't always have immediate answers, but the act of asking them begins reconnecting you with your internal compass. And the more time you spend paying attention to your real thoughts, feelings, and preferences, the clearer your authentic identity becomes. At first, the process might feel uncertain. You might realize some choices in your life were shaped more by expectation than genuine desire. But that realization isn't something to fear. It's the beginning of clarity. Because authenticity isn't about becoming a completely different person. It's about removing the layers that were never truly you in the first place. And once those layers start falling away, something surprising begins to happen. Life doesn't become more complicated. In many ways, it becomes simpler. Because when your actions finally match your real identity, something powerful emerges. A quiet form of confidence. The kind that doesn't depend on approval. And that's where the real power of authenticity begins to show itself. The unexpected power of authenticity. Something interesting begins to happen when people start living more authentically. At first, the change feels small. You speak a little more honestly. You stop pretending to enjoy certain things. You allow yourself to express opinions that you once kept hidden. These may seem like minor shifts, but internally, they create something powerful. Alignment. Your thoughts, your words, and your actions begin moving in the same direction. And when that alignment appears, something many people haven't felt in years begins to return. Inner peace. Because when you're no longer constantly managing a performance, your mind becomes quieter. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You stop worrying as much about whether people approve of you. You stop exhausting yourself trying to maintain an image. Instead, you simply show up as you are. And this is where the real paradox of authenticity appears. Most people believe they must perform in order to be liked. But in reality, constant performance often creates shallow connections. When people only see the version of you designed to impress them, the connection stays on the surface. But when you begin expressing your real personality, your genuine thoughts, interests, and perspectives, something different happens. The people who resonate with the real you begin to move closer, and the people who don't naturally move away. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. Losing certain social connections may feel like rejection, but over time, something much more valuable replaces those shallow connections. Authentic relationships. Relationships where you don't feel pressure to constantly impress, where conversations feel natural instead of calculated, where you can disagree without fearing that the connection will disappear. And those relationships are often far more fulfilling than dozens of surface-level interactions. Authenticity also changes something deeper inside you. It builds a form of confidence that performance can never create. Because real confidence isn't about appearing perfect. It's about knowing that even if someone disagrees with you, even if someone criticizes you, you're still being true to who you are. That kind of confidence is stable. It doesn't collapse when approval disappears. And ironically, when people stop trying so hard to be liked, others often start respecting them more. Because authenticity signals something powerful. It shows that a person values truth more than approval. And that quiet strength is something people naturally recognize. But perhaps the greatest reward of authenticity isn't social approval or confidence. It's something much simpler. Freedom. Freedom from constantly monitoring yourself. Freedom from worrying about whether you're living up to someone else's expectations. Freedom from feeling like you're playing a role in your own life. And once someone experiences that freedom, they begin to understand something that changes everything. They were never meant to spend their life performing. They were meant to live it. Which brings us to one final question, a question that might be uncomfortable, but incredibly important to ask yourself. So after everything we've explored in this video, there's one question that quietly remains, a question that only you can answer. Who are you when nobody is watching? Not the version of you that shows up on social media. Not the version shaped by expectations. Not the version that learned to behave a certain way just to be accepted. But the real person underneath all of that. The one with opinions that may not always be popular. The one with interests that may not impress everyone. The one with dreams that don't necessarily match what others expect. Because somewhere along the way, many people slowly trade that real self for something else. They trade honesty for approval, authenticity for acceptance, identity for performance. And the strange part is, the world often rewards that performance. People who fit in are praised. People who follow expectations are celebrated. People who avoid conflict are considered easy to like. But quietly beneath all of that approval, something important gets lost. The experience of living as yourself. And that loss is subtle. You may still achieve success. You may still build relationships. You may still create a life that looks perfectly fine from the outside. But internally there can be a quiet voice asking a question that refuses to disappear. Is this really me? Because deep down, every human being has an internal compass. A sense of what feels true and what feels forced. When you follow that compass, life may not always be easier, but it feels more real. Your choices feel intentional. Your relationships feel genuine. Your confidence comes from alignment rather than approval. And perhaps most importantly, you stop feeling like a character inside your own life. Instead, you become the author of it. So take a moment and ask yourself a few honest questions. What opinions have you been afraid to express? What parts of your personality have you hidden to make others comfortable? What decisions have you made mainly to avoid disappointing people? And if approval suddenly stopped mattering, what kind of life would you actually choose to live? Because authenticity doesn't require perfection. It simply requires courage. The courage to slowly remove the masks you've been wearing. The courage to express what you truly think. The courage to allow people to see the real version of you, even if that version isn't perfectly polished. Not everyone will understand it. Not everyone will agree with it, but the people who truly connect with you will finally be connecting with you, not the performance. And that's something far more valuable than approval. So as you leave this video, carry one simple thought with you. The world doesn't need another performance from you. It already has billions of people trying to fit into expectations. What the world rarely sees is something much more powerful. Someone brave enough to simply be real.